Hello, I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you this afternoon at this men's health event. My name is Carl Lander, and I live with a rare form of anemia, which means my red cells break up far more early than they can. I was born in 1970, which was a long way before genetic testing and genomics, etc., really ever was thought of, let alone came into such obvious and regular use now. The effect of this disease on me is that I was born very poorly and I had to have blood transfusions from birth pretty much. And in my early years, I had some surgery to remove my spleen, and that then meant that I had a pretty reasonable teenagehood. And as I got older, through my sort of mid to late 20s onwards, I required more blood transfusions. And I have a blood transfusion pretty much every week now just to keep me going. The reason I wanted to talk to you about what genetic testing means to me is that I had a diagnosis eventually at the age of 4, which was actually by looking at my red cells and working out how much of the enzyme that I lacked actually existed on those red cells. And by the age of 4, they had pretty much worked out what was going on. However, they didn't really give a final diagnosis until I was 10 years old, which is a long, as they call it, diagnostic journey, diagnostic odyssey. Now, for me, the genetic testing came obviously much later in life, probably about 5 or 8 years ago. And what that's meant for me is that it's absolutely confirmed my diagnosis, which would never have happened. And this is actually, I wrote, along with some very eminent colleagues around the globe, some guidelines on how to diagnose and treat this disorder. And the key thing now actually is both looking at the red cells and having a genetic diagnosis. Now, my mutation codes are ones that I'm quite lucky in that they respond to a drug that's been developed over the last few years, which I now take. However, if I didn't have that genetic diagnosis and those indications of actually where my mutations are, that therapy wouldn't have been available to me at all. So it's made a significant difference having a proper diagnosis. And actually, I'm really proud of my diagnosis. And I have on my right inner wrist a tattoo of a double helix of DNA and the mutation codes that I've got. And actually, when I was working through with some clinicians in London, they wanted actually to know my mutation codes. So I literally sent them a photograph of my wrist because I couldn't find the email. What does it mean growing up with a rare disease? So my rare disease actually is quite severe for me. So I grew up not being able to do sport. I was pretty good at cycling, but I couldn't do football and play all those things as a child. I'm a lot shorter than I probably would be compared to certainly to the rest of my family. My grandfather and father were really quite tall. I'm not. I'm about 5'5" now, having shrunk a little over the last few years. And on top of that, one of the side effects of a thing called a hemolytic anemia, which is what I've got, is your red cells break up and they produce a yellow substance that the liver breaks down and generates so you can remove it from the body called bilirubin. Bilirubin is bright yellow. Now, you may have seen a number of people with liver failure who are quite jaundiced, i.e., they have yellow skin, yellow eyes. The thing about my blood disorder is that I don't have enough red cells floating around my body. So whereas people have kind of a hint of jaundice, their skin maybe a bit orangey, etc., I was always banana yellow as a child, and right the way through, um, probably till about 10 or 15 years ago when I started having more transfusions and stopping that breakdown of red cells so rapidly. So it's not great for dating, is it, being bright yellow? And so relationships, when I was younger, were curious and tricky. But when I did my training, I'm a nurse by background. When I did my training, I met my wife and we got married about a year and a half later. So we actually met in the nurse's home where we lived. And we had kids, but those kids came along slowly than we would have liked, or rather, say more slowly. And yeah, that kind of stuff's been tricky. And then when the kids grew up, Dad was the one who couldn't play sport. I couldn't play football with them. I couldn't go on the long cycle rides that kids wanted to do, and they were particularly keen on walking, as is my wife. Or that kind of, it really impacts you as a man, that it's tricky to live a proper family life. And there are these kind of ideas, people could call them spoons and all sorts of things in long-term conditions. So you've only got so much energy in your battery every day. And I've always worked. I worked clinically for a number of years until eventually I decided that my background was in intensive care, and the sorts of bugs and bacteria I was picking up was too much. So I retired from that, or moved on from that. I'm actually fully retired now. And I will spanned a number of roles in the NHS and other organisations. So I've worked all my life. Um, and that's been hard because you have to put all your energy into work. And it was really important for us that I could go to work, because I was lucky that I had jobs that were reasonably well paid. And that meant a lot of travel, a lot of time away from home, living out of a suitcase. But it's possible. But of course, that takes its toll when you get home on Thursday night, having driven from the other side of London and been away all week. You just kind of need to rest up a bit. So the kids are expecting you home, they're expecting to do fun things, and actually all you want is that armchair and a bit of a sleep. So it does add quite a lot of load onto you as a breadwinner, really, and that's not any way misogynistic. It's just how our family circumstances worked at the time. And then over time, I got jobs where I was actually able to work from home, and the kids were older, and that was fine. So they were much more independent, but we could do the fun things at weekends because it meant I could have less travel, less commuting. I always worked the silly long hours as anybody does in the health service, but it meant I could contribute to the family. I could contribute to the type of work I like doing. I was a school governor. I was involved in all sorts of organisations as I am now. And that meant that I could actually give something back, which I think a lot of people with long-term conditions do feel, sadly, that something is owed by them to others. Certainly I did, and still do. But since I've started having more transfusions, things have got a lot better for me. I am still a wheelchair user. I use a powered wheelchair most of the time. Um, And one of the side effects, of course, of having this type of anemia is that the iron levels in the blood build up, and that can damage organs. So I've got heart failure, liver cirrhosis, thyroid dysfunction. But that's okay because there are some great treatments out there, and there is a great level of support. But when you're in your kind of just pre-mid 50s, and someone says to you, look, things are pretty grim now. And therefore, we need to think about what we're going to do when you get really poorly next time. And I had that conversation a year or so ago, year and a half ago now. And that conversation ended up with me saying, okay, then it sounds like if my heart stops beating, there's no point in trying to get it going again. So I made that decision at that point that I didn't want to be resuscitated. Now, luckily, because of this new drug and some amazing care and some other fantastic drugs for heart failure, I'm not in that predicament anymore, and I've changed that decision. So there's a lesson there, I think, in health, that things do vary and that hope should never be given up. But when you're having to sit down in your kind of just before your mid-50s and talk to your children about, look, this may not happen. I may not get to see you graduate. I may not get to see you get that promotion. That's kind of rough, and takes a toll. But I'd always say there's hope. There's always hope. And I did have a very bizarre conversation with my mother about her will, and making sure that provisions were made for my family if I wasn't here, which I have to say very fairly were dealt with. But that is hard work. And I think having these sort of disorders in a world where there is an expectation that everybody will go to work. It's not a gender-based thing anymore. But as a man, when you can't do the things that are expected of you, it does make you feel inadequate at times, and it does make you feel pretty poor and pretty low. However, I would always say there's hope. I have, you know, physically got more able, not massively, but I can now, you know, do more things than I want to do. I don't feel so horrendous. I mean, I have retired, as I said, and that's been so much more easy for me. I do travel. I'm very lucky to be involved in a couple of organisations um, to do with my blood disorder and inherited metabolic disorders, so I get to travel. I also am involved in a registry for my blood disorder, so I get to travel around the world sometimes. That isn't easy. That requires a lot of planning. Um, how to get yourself around the airport with a wheelchair and a suitcase is not always the easiest thing, but it's perfectly possible. And I would say that there is much going on at the minute around disability, and which isn't always positive, isn't it? But I would say look at people like myself, look at people around you, and recognize that people are working really hard to keep going. I don't like the word sufferer or victim or struggle or anything like that. I don't think that's sensible wording for me. Other people may be fine with that. But what I would say is, I'd ask society to look at people like myself and say, we just need a bit of extra help. But it does make you feel, uneasy. And I certainly remember when I started using a mobility scooter, I was quite large at the time. My diabetes and therapy made me put quite a lot of weight on. Plus, probably wasn't eating the right foods at the time at all. So I always made sure that when I was on my scooter or even when I use my wheelchair, I always wear reasonably smart clothes. I don't want someone looking down at me and saying, "Well, he's only there because he eats too much. He's too fat to get around." And then I think there are judgments that happen, and they have a huge impact on your mental health and your mental well-being. So I think my key message to you is that life can be tricky with a rare disease. I think genetic testing is a phenomenal process. I've known young people, both here and abroad, diagnosed with my blood disorder within months now. As long as the indications are there and the specialist teams actually understand what's going on, they can organise the right tests very quickly, and the right therapies and the right processes can be put in place. I'd also say that, as I said throughout, there is always hope. There is always hope for a decent life. I don't think that this ever is anything really negative. You can get through it, but I know people find it tricky as men. And I was at a conference in the States a couple of years ago when we were all talking about these kind of issues, that it is tough, you feel inadequate. However, there are ways forward, and I think, genetic testing is the way forward so that we can get on and support people with the right treatments much earlier in life, which would have been hugely beneficial for me. I had the best care available, but because of that care, I ended up with organ damage, and that is the only care I could have had back then. But at least now we know much more about how to treat these things, because we can look inside cells and understand what's going on at that really, really low level. So I hope this has been useful, and enjoy the afternoon. I think it's really good that we've got an event for Men's Health Week. And yeah, thank you.